Welcome to the Putting on the Pitch Philly Style web panel. I'm Sougato, Director of Partnering at Bio, and I'll be moderating a great session that will help you perfect your pitch to in-licensors and investors. During this webinar, one of the things you'll hear is that making deals is a numbers game. The more one-on-one meetings you do, the better. And there's no better place to do one-on-ones than the Bio International Convention, June 15th through 18th in Philadelphia. We'll be unveiling a new partnering system that will truly supercharge your experience. Now let's join Arpita Maiti, Director of External R&D and Innovation at Pfizer, Nguyen, Senior Analyst at Sofinnova Ventures, Doug MacDougall at MacDougall Biomedical Communications, and Linda Pullan of Pullan Consulting for the Inside Scoop. This web panel is sponsored by Innova, your partnering place, and Thomson Reuters, bringing intelligence to life, sciences that is. Now let's get right to it. Here's Putting on the Pitch, Philly style.
Let's get started. We have a great panel for you today. This panel will really help you perfect your pitch both during partnering meetings and company presentations and otherwise. You should have a great time and get some great advice today. So with that, I would like to let all the panelists give a quick introduction for themselves. Let's start with you, Arpita.
Okay, so I'm Arpita Maiti. I'm at Pfizer, based here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I am a member of the ERDI, or External R&D Innovation Group, within Pfizer. We are not part of business development, but we are a separate group that works very closely with BD, and we essentially have a search and evaluation function. I support the Inflammation and Immunology Research Unit, and I'm looking for opportunities everywhere from early research, early discovery, all the way to end of proof of concept or phase 2. And my background is I am an immunologist by training. I've worked in academia, as from postdocing all the way to industry and device companies, as well as most recently at Vertex Pharmaceuticals in an alliance management function. So that's my background. I've moved from science to, I guess, what people would call the dark side.
Great, thank you. Next, Tom Nguyen from Sofinnova.
All right. So first of all, I want to thank Bio for inviting me to participate in this. So I'm a senior analyst at Sofinnova Ventures, which is a healthcare venture capital firm. Been around a while in the Bay Area. We're investing out of our 9th fund right now. Prior to that, I was an analyst principal at a mutual fund, so kind of the public side, called Jemison Associates. And then prior to that, I was a sell side, what's called a sell side biotech analyst at a number of banks, including Jefferies and Piper. So relevant here, my perspective is I've seen many, and like many of the others here, seen many presentations by both private and public companies, pretty much from your single-person company all the way up to your large public companies.
Great, thank you. And Doug, go for it.
Okay, this is Doug MacDougall. I'm President of MacDougall Biomedical Communications. We manage communications for about 75 firms around the world, relevant to all life science and biotechnology companies. And our specialty is really helping to position those companies and get the right messages for their audiences, whether it being partners or investors as being the key people, and then eventually clinicians and patients. My passion is actually working with, hold on, my computer's falling. My passion is really working with educating and the senior management teams of these companies to get their message right, and have done work with Bio over the years around this convention, including running a panel 30-second pitch called Son of a Pitch, and back about 5 years ago running executive workshop series on how to present to investors and partners.
Thanks, Doug. And for those of you who may not know, Doug's series, Son of a Pitch, is quite popular and a great forum. So, Linda.
Okay, I'm Linda Pullan, Pullan Consulting. I started in industry and drug discovery as a biochemist for about 10 years in big pharma, and then switched to licensing at what was then Zeneca, now AstraZeneca, and then was head of oncology licensing at Amgen. And I've been helping small companies as a consultant for about 9 years now, and help with shaping presentations as well as with outreach and negotiations and basically anything needed to partner. And I'm looking forward to this, and thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Linda. And for those of you who don't know Linda very well, Linda's been a veteran in the business development consulting area for a number of years. I know a lot of great companies have used her services. And Linda, you recently were involved in quite a big deal in China, perhaps the biggest deal in China. So that's some really exciting news. So there may be a little bit of an echo from me, but that's not what we deal with on the internet. So let's jump right into our first question. Since we're talking about an upcoming partner at the Bio International Convention, what are some tips and tricks on how companies can get that meeting with you at a partnering convention like Bio International? What are the things that usually they should put in their subject line? What are the things they should put in the body of their message to get your attention? I see messages all the time where the subject line is just, let's meet. And I get the sense that those aren't very useful, but can you give us some perspective of how should you send a partnering request at a partnering conference so it has the highest likelihood of being accepted by the person you're reaching out to? What are some good pointers?
I guess I'll start. So, I guess, from my perspective, obviously the best way to do this thing is to have a prior relationship and, having someone introduce you, or you're having already knowing part of the story at least. But let's presume it's an anonymous or no prior relationship and you're making a cold call, so to speak. I think you just keep it short and sweet, and you try to think of this as the proverbial elevator pitch, where you try to think of the top things that might make you exciting to someone. Don't try to be too controversial or too trendy in your subject line. Just be very direct, potential meeting, and then think of yourself as an elevator pitch, saying upcoming phase 2 data or whatnot, strong team out of, Dublin, Ireland, in what space, cystic fibrosis, next data point, whatever. And that will be either I'll have decided to take the meeting at that point or I won't. There's really not much else you can do, but my vote is to keep it short and sweet. I'd love to hear what others think.
I concur on keeping it short. I'd say 3 to 5 bullets is about as much as you want to put in there. And I do believe in being very specific, and I would use subject lines like exciting preclinical cancer stem cell small molecule for melanoma or something of the sort. Lots of specificity so that people immediately know why you're asking for a meeting.
And this is Doug. I've had many friends in the BD side of the pharma tell me that they'll get 600 to 700 requests that they may need to get through, and actually that first sentence is very critical because if they don't understand the therapeutic area you're in almost immediately, so they can forward it to the right people for evaluation, is very critical to get that in there. And just having a sentence of meeting unmet medical needs in Cambridge Biotech Company doesn't get you there. So you got to be a little bit specific, be short, because usually if they don't get something out of the first sentence, they go to the next person and you just get thrown in the trash. So it's very important to get that first or second sentence in there so they at least know where to direct your inquiry so it could be evaluated further.
So Arpita, that's a great point from Doug.
Yeah, I agree. I think all good points, actually. The only thing I would add to that is maybe add your company name in the subject line. That always helps when I get 800 requests. And as Doug pointed out, the therapeutic area, those critical 2 sentences, what stage of development, because if I'm not interested, I have 30 colleagues in my ERD organization as well as business development. I may be able to funnel it to the appropriate person.
maybe you could give us a little bit more background of a continuation of what Doug was saying, and Tommy, you too, of how many meeting requests do companies like Pfizer and Sofinnova, and of course Sofinnova and Pfizer are very different companies, but how many meeting requests do you get? I know from our statistics, companies like Pfizer usually end up having about 300, several hundred meetings at something like Bio International, but how many incoming meeting requests do you get? And explain a little to us what the scenario is where you have to evaluate, X hundred requests in, X hours.
Right. So I believe last year, so all the requests come into the Pfizer mailbox. I believe we had something like 800 plus requests. They tend to be directed towards people because, we have our therapeutic area coverage, but sometimes they're not. So it's a little bit of a challenge sorting through all that. I certainly hope the Innova, the new system, is going to make that a little easier. In terms of how many meetings we each take and how we sort through that and the timing, I basically spent the 2 weeks before Bio last year almost exclusively sorting through the meetings and setting up the meeting requests and prioritizing, and also talking to my colleagues. There's a lot of discussion between your colleagues as to who needs to be at those meetings, who will head those meetings. We can't be everywhere at once. It's basically divide and conquer. The other thing I'll say is that I personally, I believe I did 40 meetings in 4 days, 44 meetings. It was maybe a little too much. I will say that most of those were actually pretty productive. I would give it a 25% success rate in terms of what we went forward with and continuing discussions. In terms of deals, that number is a little bit lower, but certainly I think it's probably down to maybe 2 to 5% that you actually continue to a point where you're actually in a negotiation. Sure.
And Tommy, what about you?
Yeah, no, those are great comments. I agree, especially at Sofinnova, we work as a partnership, so the inbound emails are usually directed to specific individuals, and then we'll sit down at a kind of internal meeting and kind of compare notes and see what needs to be. And there'll be a singular calendar set up that aggregates everybody's requests, and then we just have to kind of prioritize, kind of like everyone else, what makes the most sense to meet with. The meetings are never long enough. They're typically intro meetings. You get hundreds, I don't know what the exact number is, hundreds to thousands. It's a lot. And then there's a first screen, and then even after the first screen, there's still too many meetings, and there's always a bandwidth problem for our small partnership. So I think that a lot in terms of what comes out of those meetings. A lot of those meetings move forward. Again, I don't have an exact number for you, but they are usually very productive to at least set up the very next meeting, whereby we can then dive in more deeply and perhaps go under CDA with the companies that are the most interested.
Great, and I wanted to take a minute, because I forgot to do this, to tell the audience that we are taking their questions live during this, so they can enter their questions on the GoToWebinar dashboard, and then we'll be looking through the questions and asking some of those questions live. So thanks again for those perspectives. So let's switch to the pitch deck a little bit. There's always that question of, how long is a pitch deck supposed to be? Let's say at a partnering meeting, you have 25 minutes to go through the meeting. Of course, 5 minutes is the hi, hello, I'm so-and-so, exchange the business cards, so maybe you really end up with 20 minutes. Some people say 5-slide deck and the rest of it in the appendix. Some people say 12-slide deck and some slides in the appendix, and some people say just have a 30-slide deck and everything right out there, and that may be different between something, a in-licensor versus a venture cap firm. But what are some of your thoughts on, what is the ideal length of that pitch deck, and how should it be structured a little bit?
Oh, that's great. This is Doug. So we've been trying to figure that out actually for the last 10 years because you've only got a half an hour, and how do you make it work? We've kind of learned that, first of all, you do want to have a quick overview 5-page deck that just gives people an overview of the company A to Z, does not dig deep into the programs, but is more towards the partner You know, you don't need to go into the management team and the board of directors and all that other stuff, but a quick 5-slide deck. And then have 5 or 6 slides on each of your programs, or maybe 5 or 6 slides on some data as backup slides. But the key is not just go in there and show your deck. To me, you spend 2 minutes talking about the agenda of the meeting, the background of people, and what they want to hear, and how you want that meeting to run. And that's so important before you start just delving into your 35-slide deck. If that's a scientist, they know who you are as a company, went on the web and want to do a deep dive into the program, you want to start right there so that they can get that information and you can have a conversation. If they are just coming in, it's their 35th meeting, and they didn't do their research and they just want an overview, then you have that discussion. But I'm a believer, don't tell anybody unless they want to, tell them what they want to hear.
I'd second that, and I don't tend to like to, for a corporate partner, start off with a corporate company deck, because I think that if they're not interested in what you're selling, your molecule, your program, they don't give a darn about your company.
Right.
So start off with
so basically
the material they care about.
Yeah.
So no matter what we're asking for, we always end up paying for it.
I think we have someone else on the webinar somehow. I'm not sure how.
The way we build our contract is that we plan on asking.
Hold on, let's try to figure that out. One second. I'm not sure how we have another phone call on this webinar, but that's always some of the most interesting stuff about these internet forums.
So he needs a spec sheet for the distributor. You want to send me?
We're trying to figure this out. How are we hearing someone else's phone call on this webinar? Okay. Well, while we're trying to figure that out, hopefully it's not a confidential call. Let's get some other perspectives. Arpita, Tommy, what do you think as far as your slide decks? What have been ideal?
So I think short and sweet, it really is important. It's only half an hour, so inundating me with a 30 deck deep dive into the science, it's too much. I think that you have to think about what the point is of the meeting. It's 30 minutes usually, and what you're trying to achieve. And if it literally is the introduction to your technology, then that should be the highlight. And you do spend 5 minutes introducing yourself. I like to have 5 minutes to kind of wrap up and figure out what the next steps are, even if it's just to say we'll touch base with you and let you know if we're interested. But it could be something like, hey, we really love this and we want to move quickly to CDA and a confidential discussion. I want to have that time to discuss that. So I think start with the science, leave the management side to the end, but what is important on the introduction of science is if you have a key founder and it's some really interesting science and it's from, say, MIT or from Stanford or some big heavy hitter who's a founder, that's really good to know in terms of the background of the science. And I would say 5, maybe 8 slides maximum. It really is an introduction.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of Arpita. I mean, I'm very much aligned with most of her comments. So for an introduction, it's surprising how different a 30-minute presentation is from an hour or longer. And especially when the materials, I'm going to just say, let's presume the scenario where we haven't gone over the deck in advance. So these are really these kind of JP Morgan bio type meetings where you walk into the room, meet someone for the first time, you get a little mini deck. So that should be around like Arpita described, 6 to 8 slides. I presume for a 30-minute presentation, 10 minutes or a third of that will be sticking to the slides. The rest of the time will be going off on tangents, covering things like company history, team, and we're going to go over content more later questions, I presume. But then a wrap-up, I think, is really important so that everyone's on the same page on the next steps to kind of put a punctuation mark in the meeting.
Yeah, I would like to add too. The Q&A section is very important. Leave time for Q&A. The person on the other end, you want to stimulate discussion. You don't need to tell them everything. You want them to ask the right questions because you have the right answer. You've engaged with them. And when you think about it, the purpose of these meetings is not to get a deal. The purpose of these meetings is to get another meeting or get invited back. So you don't want to be telling everybody everything all at once because there's no reason to see you again. So you want to tease. It's almost a teaser to get people interested and excited because the goal of that 30-minute meeting, or 20 minutes after everything before and after, is to get their interest so they want to call you back for another meeting.
I'll just add one more thought. Wearing both, wearing both private and public hats. It's important to know whom you're walking into the room with. Yeah. So if you're walking into the room with a generalist fund, then you want to especially say big picture and and cover things in a way that might be interesting to them. If you're walking to a room with a Sofinnova or another healthcare specialist fund or a Pfizer BD person in your space, it's very important that you have the ability to answer the questions. Nothing is worse in achieving Doug's goal, stated goal, to get another meeting, to be in the room with a scientist and have your business person not able to answer any of the questions. So that's just an example that doesn't happen too often. And that's where having a couple of appendix slides might be useful to be able to pull those out and show that you're prepared. But you don't have to cover that. It depends on what kind of meeting you're taking.
I tend to do it not as appendices, but rather I do tend to bring longer than 5 slides. Just probably 15 is about my norm. But I'm prepared with one slide, the first slide, to have the entire discussion if it's going to be high level and conceptual, versus if you're meeting, say, someone who plays the same role on the other side as I do, and they really do want to understand the science behind the opportunity enough to assess that it's novel, that it's at the appropriate stage, that the mechanism is tied to the efficacy, then yes, we're going to dive into much more content. And I think it is true. You do not want to leave that meeting with a person feeling you were ill prepared to answer their question. And I also think there's sort of the potentially two decks. Either you browse a longer deck, or you think about the short deck and your, quote, leave piece, your follow-up piece, which is a more meaty deck. Because if you're using your 5-slide sort of intro deck, the follow-up should probably not be that 5-slide intro deck, but more content.
So one question we get quite, yes, sure, go ahead, Arpita.
One thing, because this happened to me at Bio, and I felt very bad. I know everyone has their decks on their iPads, and it's great until you run out of juice on the iPad. And the folks that had the old-fashioned paper flip charts, they had it every time, right? So just remember, you can't always plug in your iPad at Bio at 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
That's a great point, Arpita. At Bio, from the completely other end, working at the partnering desk, we have tons of people running up to us and saying, my iPad battery just died, can you print my deck for me, please? So generally, we don't have that much paper, but we'll try to accommodate those requests as needed. But yes, it's always good to have that paper print out. I can tell you from all those people that ask us to print out their decks. So one additional question on the deck. Usually there's that question of the sales forecast, the market size, the discount factor slide in the deck. Is that something that the seller should include at the deck, or is that something that generally buyers are just like, I'm not going to believe this, I'm going to do my own analysis? Is it even worth putting in the deck?
I can start, or Arpita, or whoever. Well, I'll start with yeah, I'll start and maybe put out the controversial point. So I think it's absolutely critical to hear the company's view on the topic and have a slide. Now, the flip side of that is I may be, especially for an early stage company, in complete disbelief that they may have a good understanding of it. And regardless, we'll have to do my own work. We'll have to do our own work, especially in a nascent market that hasn't been established. There's not a product on the market for which we can comp or prescriptions. So, but it's absolutely critical, and we can talk about this later, as to it's also a benchmark for me of how the company thinks and discusses and their level of sophistication. how well do they understand the business that they're going into. So that's a reason why I think it's critical to talk about it.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree for all the same reasons Tommy said. You know, it's really helpful for me to understand, especially when we get to the negotiation, the transactional side, where the partner's coming from, and it's often based on those numbers, and you can build or manage expectations sometimes. And Pfizer, we're going to do all that. We have huge groups of people who do all that analysis anyway, but it does help us understand the benchmarks that we're working with.
Yeah, this is Doug. I agree 100% that there are some boundaries, though. You know, you don't need to have a slide that there's 25 million people with cardiovascular disease out there. Everybody knows that. So, you know, if your product is positioned to be competitive with other products out there, that's great to put that up there. If it's positioned as potentially a total new market, then you probably need to dig a little bit deeper because they may not understand it. And especially if it's a BD scout person on the partnering side, they're really thinking of it from the market perspective more than the science. But if you're sitting down with someone who's a scientist, it's probably not as important to be talking about that.
And I think it's terrible to start out and say, okay, we're going to take 5% of the Alzheimer's market, and that's billions of dollars.
Yeah.
Because people do that all the time without any specificity for what the 5% is or how you're going to get it. Nobody wants to hear that you're going to take some piece of a huge market and therefore it's a huge seller. They want to hear your positioning in the marketplace, what it is that makes your compound special and how it will compete, not a small percentage of a huge market.
Right.
That is that lack of sophistication.
Yep.
So the other related slide is the comp slide. How worthwhile is that comp slide to to kind of give the buyer or investor an idea of what are the similar deals that may be comparable in similar companies?
I think again, it's like Tommy said, it's benchmarking. It really helps you understand what their expectations are. It may not be in line with what a Pfizer's expectations are, but it does help us understand where the partner's coming from.
I generally wouldn't want to put it in an introductory deck. I think there's a lot to sort through before you get to the point where you're worrying about comps in a partnering deal. And I would say don't price something until you know what's for sale. And so the discussion of what the assets are needs to be fairly well thought through before you worry about the price tag.
I agree.
I'd be interested to hear your perspective too.
I actually agree with Linda. When I look at a slide deck, I look at it like a SWOT analysis. You've got the strengths and the opportunities, which the internal and external factors, and those are the things you want to be highlighting that are positive for you as a company. And your weaknesses actually are your use of proceeds or why I want to partner with you, and the threats are the questions, which may be the competitive landscape that most people are going to ask you. And I like to think of the competitive slide as kind of your ace in the hole, so that because that's the first question a lot of people are going to ask you is what makes your product different than this company, because they put you in a box. And you come up and have that as a backup slide to answer those questions very quickly. It's almost like guaranteed the next meeting if you do a great job doing it. So use that as a real opportunity. Don't put it in front of them because we know it's going in their head, and use that as a great backup if that's where the conversation goes.
So one last question on.
So can I think this is a critically important question. So I think that it can be a strength to have a competitive slide. It speaks to a more sophisticated company and team who can use that slide to their advantage. So obviously, if someone doesn't feel very comfortable talking about it, then you can leave it out. You don't want to comp to specific deals or so forth. But I think that's an opportunity to talk about, as Doug said, competition, how you're differentiated, an opportunity to talk about it as a landscape maybe, and possibly not as an M&A deal value or so forth. And then, because people will be thinking about what's your end market sizing, what is your tail risk, and so forth. And those, if you can help them solve a lot of these problems and make it fit their screen sooner rather than later, that's always helpful. And again, another benchmark of sophistication of the team.
So one last question on the slide deck before we move to a couple of other things. Pictures versus words. There's always this question of, do I have a slide with 12 bullet points and keep it kind of wordy, or do I just concentrate on 2 or 3 bullet points on each slide with a nice, picture demonstrating, whatever it is, a graph or process and so forth. What's your take on it? Because I've seen slide decks that are, like novels, and some that are like storybooks.
Who wants to tackle that one first? I wish we didn't have things like PowerPoint slides and had like your photos you take out like you show of your children or your data, one data point. Because when you're in a meeting, you want to engage with the person on the other side. And if you're sitting there staring at the slides and they're staring at the slides, you're not having an engagement. So I actually like to say less is more whenever you have that opportunity. And you always have that kind of that killer data slide. Sometimes I had one client that just walked around with one slide. It was that killer data slide where the 2 lines separated, and that was his whole pitch, and had the conversation. And he would really engage people. So be careful putting too much on the slides. You don't want people reading them. That's my feeling.
And I think it's terrible when people have such a wordy slide that your recipient's eyes glaze over and they sort of roll back, oh no! So do keep those bullets short and not lots of text. I think it illustrates your ability to summarize things conceptually when you can take your first draft that's a lot of words and boil it down to a key concept and message that you can talk about at greater length, but really don't make them novels. Again, this is an introductory meeting, and they won't get read. The things that are really hard to digest, Arpita's folks get so many of them, they end up on a pile to be dealt with later, and never get dealt with later. It's asking too much of your reader to force them to work too hard to understand what it is that you're offering.
Great. So now let's move on to a little bit of a different question. I was again, it's Stanford Spark a couple of months ago, where they had invited 10 kind of heads or senior BD people from pharma to come and give kind of a overview of what their thoughts are of how academics can make progress getting funding and getting licensed and so forth. And the question, came up of how far does my asset, does my project have to be along for me to come to you? And again, this wasn't VCs, this was pharmas, but it's a common question that most people have. What is that inflection point where, especially for a preclinical novel therapeutic, when does that become desirable to you? And not necessarily in terms of, when does it become desirable to you, Pfizer or Sofinnova, but just more generically, what's your feeling on this? What have you seen? Are you looking for, mouse studies? Are you looking for proof, in other words, proof of principle in animal models, development candidate ready for IND, composition of matter, SARS toxicology, and what's kind of the level that you look for, not just when you'll say, hi, that's great, let's meet in a year and tell me where you are, but what's the point where you're like, okay, I'm genuinely interested, let's start to talk about a potential deal?
Maybe I'll start here. So I hate to say it, but I think it depends. If it's a known target that a lot of people have worked on, maybe there's a couple of assets that are a little further ahead, then I probably want to see, if I don't see proof of concept or proof of mechanism, I at least want to see GLP tox. I want to know that you have a safe molecule or a safe antibody, or I want to know some aspect of safety, because I'm going to be in my head comparing it to whatever else is out there in the same mechanistic class, say. If it's a completely novel target or a new approach, that's a little different. I mean, there I might just want to see some efficacy data, something really that's going to wow me in an animal model or two. And that will be sufficient to take it into the research unit and have some of the scientists assess it. You know, there's some early fields in immunology that right now where you probably only really need to see 1 or 2 animal models, and you say, hey, that's something I really am interested in looking at. You know, we're Pfizer. If you send me another JAK compound, I'm probably going to say, you know, I want to see a little bit more. So that's my take on it. I know it's not a satisfying answer, but it's the best I can come up with.
Yeah, it's great to hear Arpita's answer. I agree with a lot of that. I'll just, I completely agree with the depends part. This is probably one of the most important questions that's been asked so far, and also the hardest to answer in a concrete way. So I'll just add that one key thing is the time value creation aspect of it. So how much money to what value creation milestone, and how long will it take to get there? And so there's a certain time factor for it. So if I get a sense within my criteria that it's a reasonable amount of time to get to a highly value creating milestone with the dollars that we're putting in, that's the trifecta for me. And what that milestone is, as Arpita has outlined, depends on what they are. Is the strategy, is the development strategy a fast follower, or is it a completely novel mechanism and building a new market? There's completely different value propositions there and require different diligence and understanding. So, but the trifecta, as I said, time to value, capital, and what that value milestone is, probably the top question.
Yeah, we struggled with this many years ago, I remember, and Linda may remember this, but I don't know if you remember back in 2003, I think when Nguyen was really getting into partnering, they actually posted a list of the things that you had to do before you could walk in the door, preclinical studies with a compound, which was really interesting. We actually took that and developed some slides for clients and broke the list down to maybe the 7 key experiments you need to do to, you know, validate your drug and get them over certain hurdles. And it'll be different for every molecule and every indication. But we have developed for a lot of our slides, you create this list, and then you put check marks on the ones you've done, and then you're telling the person at the same time, this is what we've done, this is what we know we have to do to be able to get full proof of concept or even go into humans or whatever. And that really makes the conversation, everybody understands each other right away of where you are in the status, and then you can show this backup data slides. And then the conversation can move on and say, well, you check off these 2 blocks, I want to see you again. And it really kind of sets the stage nicely.
I think that could be very, very useful. But I do think the key concept is that you want to have data that demonstrate differentiation.
Oh, yeah.
So what the differentiation is what drives how much data you need to have. If for instance, the differentiation is I'm more efficacious, then you darn well have to have in vivo efficacy models. If the differentiation is I have a completely new chemical series, then maybe you don't need that efficacy model. It really depends on why this one is special, and that's the data you need to demonstrate.
Yep.
I think that's a great point by Linda. That's a great way.
So let me shift quickly to a. Absolutely, thank you, Linda. Let me shift quickly to a incoming question from our audience. This is from Rhonda. I don't know which company, but she is Rhonda. What kind of materials should you leave behind after the pitch in a partnering meeting? Anything other than a business card?
Not at the meeting. These poor people get so much that if you're handing them things, they'll be overwhelmed. So I believe in follow-up after the meeting, and that also gives you a second chance to tell your key points.
Yep.
Do you agree, Arpita?
I totally agree. I walked away with a pile of business cards that were so huge that they didn't fit in my bag. So if you can imagine, if I also got paper PowerPoint, I'd be shipping that by FedEx, and that's I don't like to check anything. So And you're absolutely right, Linda. It gives you the opportunity a week or two later to follow up with me and send me an email saying, hey, it was great to meet you at Bio, really had a great conversation. I'm just sending you the non-confidential deck again, and I want to know, are you interested? When can we expect to touch base again and move forward? That's perfect from my perspective.
So it sounds
I think that's all right. I like, I personally like to have the cards, and I like to have something in hand to remind myself that I agree with all that about that this shouldn't be in lieu of the proper follow-up immediately after the meeting, or even a reminder after that. So this might be a separate question of follow-up, but in terms of what I like to walk away with, I don't mind FedExing stuff home. So I'll keep the cards to get filed away and put on my iPhone by someone else. So I think that I actually do like to have the physical reminders as well.
You want to leave with two things, or have them leave with two things: a reason for them to want to follow up with you, and a business card. Right?
So speaking of follow-ups, it's a good transition topic. What is the appropriate follow-up? I mean, you had this partnering meeting. You think it went great. You exchanged the business cards. How long until you follow up? How many times do you follow up? If the first time you follow up, you don't get a response. How much of a pest you should be? I mean, this is kind of like dating almost. That you had your just lunch, or you had your just coffee, and now how long do you wait? How persistent are you? What's the appropriate way of following up? And when you follow up, what should be in those follow-ups? Some non-confidential deck, but is there anything else?
I'd like to take it back a little bit, because before you leave the meeting, you want to have a conversation with that person of how should I follow up? Are there other people within the organization that I should be approaching? Can you make introductions to me to those appropriate people? Just kind of get more and more information from them of the process, so that you have multiple opportunities and multiple reasons to maybe follow up, whether it's not just following up and giving another pitch, but following up through introductions, because some of these firms, have layers and layers of people, and there may be somebody that, that Arpita may know within the organization that might be interested in this. If you don't ask her about that, then you may never get that information. So I say a lot of it happens of how you set the stage before you leave the meeting.
So I totally agree with you, Doug. That's why I like that last 5 or 10 minutes to kind of set the stage for what comes next. Part of what I want to know also is your timeline, right? So if you're a startup company, or you've got your Series A and you decide you're going to start a Series B, and that's why you're talking to Pfizer as well, I need to understand the timing so that I can prioritize things as well. I don't certainly want to leave you guys in the lurch. So having that conversation about where the company is, and then we can also talk process in terms of where Pfizer is and the process Pfizer takes. You're right, Pfizer is a huge organization. Depending on where your asset is or your technology, I might need to talk to other colleagues in other business units and other therapeutic areas within the research unit. Again, there's a lot of people that need to be contacted. I'm usually the central conduit for that information, as well as my other nerdy colleagues. And so it takes a little time. So I would say in terms of a follow-up, let's do the setup at the end of the meeting at Bio. And then usually for follow-up, send me things in the next week or two after that, understanding, and I will respond and say, this is the process, as I told you at the meeting when we met at Bio, that we need a few weeks to kind of churn through all the different opportunities, prioritize, and get back to people. And so that's, again, where that important information, if you have a critical time point in the next, 1 or 2 months, you need to let us know so that we can kind of prioritize things appropriately.
I agree with all of those comments. I would just add, certainly coming out of the meeting, in addition to what Doug said, if there are outstanding questions that your investors asked you in the meeting, it is always appropriate to follow up with some answers to that. That's just natural, and frankly, it would be weird to not try to answer them. I think that in terms of the overall question of how aggressive, I think you can be very aggressive. And to use Sougato's analogy of speed dating, I think there's a point to which it becomes inappropriate, but that point is pretty pretty far along, meaning you should feel free to be very aggressive, knowing that Arpita and other investors and other corporates have a very busy schedule. They need to be reminded, and really only you and your management knows what your timeline is for financing or other milestones. So I actually would tell companies it's very important that if you know you have something that you want that investor or company to be in on, to remind them that this is coming up, or exactly how much time they have to do the work before they're past the point of no return.
Yeah, to people like Arpita and to Tommy, sending a second email, even the same email a second time, makes a big difference, because I know you guys have a lot of stuff that gets sent to you. I do as well, and it's usually that person that reminds you that, oh, that email got down to 500 down, and I was going to respond to them and forgot about it. That happens so much these days. It doesn't hurt to send a second one.
The only thing I'd add to that is don't send the second one the next day. That's not going
No. Don't call it 2 in the morning and leave a drunk message on the cell phone.
Yeah.
That's also not appropriate.
Call from the many receptions that'll be going on in the evening time at Bio.
Right.
So those are always fun to wind down from a busy day of 40 partnering meetings. So that it's a good transition point, because I think you guys were talking about how many incoming emails and follow-ups you get, and managing all that. And one thing I want to add is this year, hopefully, at least for Bio, it'll be easier, because we're introducing this new tool called One-on-One Partnering Plus, which is really designed to help with internal collaboration throughout the entire enterprise, not just delegates that came to the convention. So hopefully our new partnering system will make that a lot easier with you with this year-round internal collaboration module. So with that, let me move on to the question of confidentiality. Now, before asking this question, let me reemphasize that no one on this call is a lawyer, and the answers to this are not construed, should not be construed as legal advice in any way. But I get the question a lot of, in a partnering meeting, assuming there's no CDA in place, can I mention something that's confidential even if it's not shown on the slide? Or if I get a question question from the prospective target that I would consider the answer to be confidential, what should I do? Should I just say, sorry, that's confidential, I can't divulge that? Does that make me look bad? So I get this question all the time from people who go to partnering meetings. What are the limits of confidentiality in a partnering meeting? Again, assuming no CDA is in place, and you don't want to look bad by simply saying, oh, it's confidential, oh, it's confidential.
Maybe I should start with that one, because I get that a lot. I'm going to say this applies to Facebook or Twitter. Anything you say, if you think you're going to find it on the New York Times tomorrow morning, don't say it, right? So that to me is what is the boundaries of confidentiality. If you're not comfortable saying something in a public forum, which a one-on-one meeting that's not confidential, you should consider as a public forum. That information can go anywhere. And then if I ask you a question, the answer is confidential information, it's perfect. I am okay with you telling me, unfortunately, I don't feel comfortable sharing that information with you unless we go under CDA. That's fine. In fact, that may actually trigger me to say, great, we're going to CDA. Yeah. So I'm not offended by somebody telling me that that's confidential information. I mean, within reason. I mean, obviously, you can't say that everything's confidential, but if it really is, I'm never going to ask you for the structure of a molecule, or, are there structural alerts or anything like that. It's perfectly reasonable for you to say that that's confidential, and when we go under CDA at the appropriate time, we'll look at structure.
I want to add, I agree with a lot of that. I want to add a few things to that. So number one, as an analyst or portfolio manager, don't be surprised if I ask the question. So unlike Arpita, I will probably ask all of those questions to you at least once, and maybe even follow up. However, I completely agree that there are definite boundaries, which are, especially on the public side, very well defined. What is material non-public information that you can or cannot share. And then I also agree, though, that it's up to management to balance that and walk the line of how much they need to tell us to make us be able to understand the opportunity that we're looking at. So I'll give you an example. There are some very technical diagnostics companies out there that involve things that are outside of our wheelhouse, such as programming in the cloud, informatics, and for those especially, it's important to get those opportunities that are very technical to understand how you could be differentiated. And I think you can say something at the 10,000-foot level and have that be understood. Sometimes you can't because it's too technical, but I do think they need to walk that line of giving us enough information to make it useful.
I would say you do need to give the party enough information so they can interpret whether they're interested or not. And if your concerns about confidentiality prohibit you from doing that, it's not worth having the discussion. And you should think about what's confidential as that which enables your competition. And typically, biology results do not enable your competition. So it's very hard to argue that biology results should be confidential. There are some exceptions, but still, get your act together such that you don't have to claim as confidential that which you need to talk about to entice people. And don't label your slides confidential if they're not really going to be under CDA. Companies hate receiving things labeled as confidential that are not really under a CDA.
Pretend you're a public company, whether you're private or not in these meetings, and someone like Arpita who may see 40 meetings in a day can't figure, at least I can't either, remember what was confidential and what was not at the end of the day. And you may be at a meeting and someone that you're talking about says, oh, I saw this great company with this diagnostics and they do this, and that was confidential. You just can't control it. It's almost impossible. So you have to, as a CEO or as a business development executive in a private company, treat these meetings as as if you're a public company, is the way I treat it, and use it as an opportunity to get the second meeting. Always.
And actually, just to add to Linda's point about confidential decks or marking things confidential, I would ask, please be very careful what you do mark as confidential or non-confidential, especially if you send me a deck and it says confidential on the bottom on it. If I open it and the minute I see that, I'm going to shut it down. I'm not even going to look at it because I don't want to contaminate Pfizer.
Right.
So if there's no CDA, please, don't send companies things that are marked confidential when you're not under CDA.
Good.
That's a great point. Moving on to another variation of the question, and we're in our final minutes, so this will probably be the final question. There's a huge international audience partnering at the Bio International Convention. That's probably why we ended up calling it the Bio International Convention. What are some of the differences when you're hearing pitches from companies that are based in the EU or Asia that should be taken into consideration? And Doug and Linda, would you have any words of wisdom for U.S. companies that are pitching to EU in-licensors or investors, or Asian in-licensors or investors? What's your thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Linda. Linda?
So anytime there's a language barrier, one wants to be cognizant of that and recognize that it can help to have more things in writing than you might have between two people who share the same idioms and patterns of speech. So I think that's the biggest message, is be aware that someone for whom English is not their first language will have a harder time following the verbal communication, and everything you can do to make that easier for them is in your interest.
Yeah, Linda makes a really good point. The language barrier is sometimes tough, and it takes your mind about 30 to 40 seconds to really kind of understand what people are saying, that they're talking, if they're speaking English, but it's a different language. So make sure you're not saying stuff that's too important really fast and really early when you are talking to people, because it takes your brain that 30 to 40 seconds to really kind of understand how, the person and make that kind of translation in your brain. And that's important. The other is shorter and sweeter. I get so many companies from Europe and especially Asia that do want to talk, about all the stuff that's really not that important to the actual meeting, and come in and talk about how important they are and things like that. And it's so important to just get to the point very quickly. And I've traveled the government of Australia and New Zealand and Korea and Finland have all hired me to go over there and help teach their people for bio. And it's very different cultures. So I've learned that the only way to best get them is get everybody down to 2 or 3 slides, get a really good key message going. You always have a chance to make the bigger, if you can get that second meeting, you always have a chance to make that bigger pitch later, but learn how to do it short and sweet.
I think the same rules apply, right, for looking at opportunity for the U.S. in terms of communication skills, focus for the presentation, getting a sense of the team and all of that. I think the only thing that, I'm not sure if this is the question, but the things that might be different for me in my mind are the answers to some of those content questions in terms of market sizing. We call it the F1 discount for a company exiting from Europe and how to translate them to the U.S. investors. So that would definitely be different, but in terms of the best practices for a bio presentation or meeting, I think the rules are the same.
Yeah, and I see a lot of Asian people come over, and I think there's some really great technology and some great science, but you do need to really customize the pitch. I find that in Europe that there's more general pitches that go out to the group, and here in the U.S. people are starting to learn that get to know your audience a little bit more. And do it, because I get a lot of emails from companies that I know the same email went to 65 different people. Customize your approaches a little bit and understand your audience. That's very important for these meetings.
I think the only thing that I would add is Pfizer has the advantage of having the scouts regionally. Yeah. And so if you are a European or an Asian company or even an Australian company, talk to the ERDI or business development folks because, and this is not true just of Pfizer, but I'm sure of all the other large pharma companies, they will have regional scouts. And so that helps with the prep and the introduction and some of the cultural issues so that 30-minute time point is really used well.
So I would like to heartily thank our panelists for this very informative web panel. We're at the end of our time. A recording of this web panel will be available, and typically our recordings get watched by plenty of people. We will distribute a link to the recording, and those links will be up on the Bio One-on-One Partnering site as well. I'd like to thank Arpita Maiti from Pfizer, Tommy Nguyen from Sofinnova Ventures, Doug MacDougall from MacDougall Biomedical Communications, and Linda Pullan from Pullan Consulting. Again, you can't get better advice than what you got in here. And I'd like to thank the sponsors for this webinar, Innova Software and Thomson Reuters. I look forward to seeing everyone at the Bio International Convention. It will be a rocking meeting in June 15th to 18th in Philadelphia. Partnering, I think, as you've picked up from this call, from this web panel, is really a numbers game. You need to get yourself out there. You need to meet with a lot of people. As Arpita mentioned in the beginning, the going to deal rate is 2 to 5%. So it's really a numbers game. You got to get out there. You got to partner. You got to make these connections. So see you at Bio International Convention. And again, thank you to all of our panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.